Once upon a time, in a town where nothing much happened, inside a very average home with beige walls and a soft ticking clock, there was a shoelace. It was beige, like the walls, not too long, not too short, just a standard respectable length for a shoelace. It had been laced through the eyelets of a very old shoe, an equally beige shoe where it lived a simple and uneventful life. The shoe belonged to a man named Gerald. Gerald was neither particularly tall nor particularly short. He was neither young nor old, neither particularly busy nor entirely unoccupied. He was, in all respects, a very ordinary man with a very predictable routine, and every morning without fail, Gerald would sit on the edge of his bed, place his foot inside his shoe, and tie the shoelace. First, he would pull the ends of the shoelace taut, not too tight, not too loose, just right. Then he would cross one lace over the other, making the beginnings of a knot, a simple knot, a careful, symmetrical knot. He would then loop one side, wrap the other around, and pull it through, creating a neat bow. A bow that was neither too large nor too small. A bow that simply existed, doing its quiet duty of keeping the shoe snugly on Gerald's foot. The shoelace had experienced this same series of events every single day for years. It never loosened too quickly, nor did it resist being untied. It simply held in place, patiently, as shoelaces do. Gerald would then stand up, testing the tightness of the shoe by gently rocking his foot back and forth. Just a little, just enough. The shoelace, steadfast and dependable, did its job without fuss or complaint, and with that, Gerald would begin his day. Each day was very much like the one before. Gerald would walk to the kitchen, his steps soft against the carpet, then firmer against the linoleum. He would make a cup of tea, carefully dipping a tea bag into the hot water, watching the colour seep out in slow swirls. He would let it steep, not too long, not too short, just the right amount of time. And as he stood there waiting, the shoelace remained tied, quiet, unbothered, secure. After breakfast, Gerald would leave the house. His shoelaces, still perfectly in place, accompanied him as he walked to the post office. Gerald did not receive much mail, nor did he send much mail, but it was a habit, and habits were important. He would glance at the various notices pinned to the community board, events he never attended, sales he never needed, services he never required. Then, satisfied, he would turn and walk back home, his shoelaces remaining ever faithful, ever still. The days passed this way, slow, gentle, repetitive. The shoelace did not mind. The shoelace did not think at all. It simply was. When the afternoon sun streamed through the window, Gerald sometimes took a nap. He would remove his shoes with a sigh, carefully untying the laces. First, he would tug at one end of the bow. Not too fast, not too slow, just a steady pull. Then he would loosen the knot, allowing the shoe to slide from his foot. The shoelace would then rest, slightly relaxed, slightly curled at the ends, waiting for its next purpose. It never felt impatient, never longed for adventure, never wished for excitement. It was content in its simplicity. Evenings were quiet. Gerald would sit in his chair, reading a book he had read before. As the pages turned slowly, the words were familiar. The shoelace, though unworn at that moment, remained in the shoe by the door, still tied in its proper bow, still ready to serve. Seasons changed. The shoelace remained. Spring brought light rain that dampened the edges of Gerald's shoes. The shoelace darkened slightly, but dried soon after. Summer brought warm air and soft breezes, though the shoelace felt no different. Autumn came with crisp leaves crunching under Gerald's feet, but the shoelace merely continued its duty, never distracted, never unravelled, and winter arrived with a quiet hush of snow, but the shoelace only felt a brief chill when Gerald stepped outside before retreating again to the warmth of home. Years passed in this way. The The shoelace remained tied, secure, waiting, until one day something changed. One morning Gerald sat on the edge of his bed, as he always did. He slipped his foot into his shoe, as he always did. He reached for the laces, ready to tie them, as he always did. But instead of forming the familiar knot, he paused. He looked at his shoes, at the slightly worn leather, at the slightly frayed ends of the laces. He sighed, and then he did not tie them. Instead, he reached for a new pair of shoes. Shoes with Velcro straps. He pulled the straps across, pressed them down. The sound was soft, final. And then Gerald stood up. The old shoes, with their very patient shoelaces, remained by the door, untied, unused, unneeded. The shoelace did not protest. It did not feel sad. It did not feel anything at all. It simply waited, and waited, and waited. And that was all. In a valley where the wind was mild, and the hills rolled gently, not too high, not too low, there was a small kingdom. It was a peaceful kingdom, a quiet kingdom, a kingdom known for one thing and one thing only, its towels. The towels in this kingdom were the softest in all the land. They were not too thick, not too thin, not too rough, not too smooth, just soft, the perfect kind of soft, the kind of soft that made people sigh a little when they touched them, not a big sigh, just a small, contented exhale. Each morning the townspeople woke up at a reasonable hour, not too early, not too late, and began their daily work. The work was not difficult. It was not exciting. It was simply the way things were. They folded towels, one by one, fold, smooth, stack, fold, smooth, stack. Some people washed the towels, some people dried the towels, some people inspected the towels, running their fingers over the fabric to ensure they were just the right amount of softness. Not too soft, not too firm, just the right kind of soft. The air always smelled faintly of freshly laundered linen, a clean, quiet scent that did not overpower but lingered gently, like a memory that did not demand attention. The sound of towels being folded was the soundtrack of the town, a soft rustling, a quiet patting, a nearly imperceptible sigh as a fresh stack was completed. The kingdom's ruler, King Edmund the Mild, presided over it all with a calm demeanour. He was not a grand king nor a particularly commanding one, but he was a fair and steady presence. Each day he would walk through the town, pausing to admire the latest batch of towels. Sometimes he would run his fingers over a particularly well-folded stack and nod approvingly. Sometimes he would say, "Ah, very nice," and that was all. Visitors came from far away to see the towels. They did not stay long, they did not do much. They simply arrived, touched a towel, sighed very softly, and then left. Some purchased towels to take home, others simply nodded in quiet appreciation and walked away, their hands lingering on the fabric for just a moment longer than necessary. One day a traveller arrived, wearing a long coat and carrying a small bag. He was not in a hurry. He approached a neatly arranged display of towels, reached out, and ran his fingers over the fabric. Pause, a breath, a small nod. "Yes," he said quietly, "that is soft." He did not ask for anything unusual. He did not request special treatment. He simply purchased a towel, tucked it carefully into his bag, and left. No one knew where he had come from. No one knew where he was going. But all agreed he had recognized true softness when he felt it. The years passed. The towels remained. The people continued their work. Fold, smooth, stack, fold, smooth, stack. Seasons changed, but the routine stayed the same. The warm months meant a slightly quicker drying time. The cooler months meant the scent of freshly laundered towels lingered a little longer in the crisp air. But no one complained. There was nothing to complain about. One afternoon, a small commotion, if it could even be called that, rippled through the town. A single towel had been found with a slightly uneven fold. Not drastically so. Just enough that when stacked, It did not sit quite as neatly as the others. The townspeople gathered around, murmuring in soft, measured tones. Interesting. An elder of the town, a woman who had spent her entire life tending to towels, carefully lifted the offending piece. She examined it under the soft light of the afternoon sun. A pause. A moment of quiet consideration. Then, with a practiced motion, she refolded it, smoothed it, stacked it. The tension dissipated. Life resumed. The festival of towels came once a year, though calling it a festival was perhaps generous. It was a day of quiet reflection. The townspeople would display their finest towels. They would admire them. They would touch them. There were no grand feasts, no loud celebrations, just the gentle appreciation of softness. At the end of the day, King Edmund would select a towel and place it in the Royal Towel Archive, a simple wooden cabinet in the castle, where only the finest examples of softness were kept. It was an honor, but a quiet one. One year a visitor asked, "Why towels?" A townsman without hesitation replied, "Why not?" And that was that. The kingdom continued. The towels endured. The people were content. Fold, smooth, stack, fold, smooth, stack. And that was all. At the edge of a quiet path, in a quiet village where things happened slowly and without urgency, there was a pebble. It was not an ordinary pebble. It was very round. Perfectly round. Not too big, not too small. Just round. It had been there for a long time. Nobody knew exactly how long. It did not move much. It did not do much. It simply sat, being round, being a pebble. Each day people walked past the pebble. Some noticed it, some did not. Those who noticed it sometimes stopped. They looked at it, nodded, perhaps thought to themselves, "That is a very round pebble," and then they walked on. Sometimes a passerby would nudge the pebble with their foot. Not too hard, not too soft, just enough to make it wobble slightly before settling back into its original spot. It never rolled far. It never went anywhere new. It simply returned to where it had always been. The seasons changed. Rain fell on the pebble, darkening its surface for a while before it dried again. The sun warmed it. The wind brushed past it. Occasionally a bird would land nearby, peck at the ground, and then leave. The pebble remained. One day a child picked up the pebble, examined it closely, and then, after a moment's thought, set it back down, in the same place, almost exactly where it had been before. A few days later, another villager, an old man who took slow, careful walks, paused beside the pebble. He bent down, running a finger across its surface. "Smooth," he said to himself, nodding once, before continuing on his way. The pebble, of course, did not respond. It had no thoughts on the matter. It was simply there. Time passed in its usual unhurried manner. The village remained quiet. The pebble remained round. Over the years, the pebble became something of a small landmark. Not an important one, just a familiar one. The sort of thing people pointed out occasionally. "See that pebble?" someone might say. "It's always been there." Visitors to the village, when told about the pebble, sometimes stopped to look at it. Observe its roundness, its smoothness. They might crouch down to touch it. A few would take a photo, and then they would move on satisfied. The villagers never thought to move it. It was part of the landscape, part of the path. If it were gone, something would feel slightly, not drastically, but slightly out of place. One autumn, a particularly strong gust of wind rustled through the village, sending leaves swirling through the air. A few of them landed near the pebble, covering it momentarily. By the next morning, the wind had shifted again, and the leaves moved on. The pebble was revealed once more, unchanged. One winter, a light snowfall dusted the ground, covering the pebble in a fine layer of white. A child, bundled in a scarf, noticed it and brushed the snow away with a mittened hand. The pebble was just as it had been before, its roundness unaffected by the cold. As years passed, the pebble witnessed the small, unremarkable changes of the village. A shop closed, another opened. A new bench was placed along the path. A tree grew taller. The people, too, changed. Some children grew up and moved away. Some old villagers no longer walked the path. But the pebble remained. One summer, a visitor from a distant town passed through. He saw the pebble and paused. "That is a very round pebble," he remarked. He considered taking it with him, carrying it home as a keepsake, but after a moment he set it back down, just as others had before him. It belonged here, he thought. And so he left it where it was. Time moved on, but the pebble did not. It had no reason to. One evening, just before sunset, an artist set up an easel nearby. She painted the path, the trees, the distant rooftops of the village, and in the foreground, the pebble. Later, when the painting was displayed in her home, someone asked, "What is that?" She replied, "A pebble, a very round pebble. It has been there for a long time." The seasons continued to change, and the village continued its quiet, steady existence. The pebble, nestled in its familiar place, waited. And that was all. Once upon a time, in a forest that was neither too big nor too small, there was a leaf. It was green in the spring, then yellow in the fall. Then, as leaves tend to do, it fell from the tree. The leaf did not fall quickly. It did not fall slowly. It simply drifted down, caught on the occasional breeze, shifting this way, then that way, until it landed gently on the ground. It did not make a sound. It simply arrived. For a time, the leaf rested where it had fallen. It did not move much, did not do much. It was simply there, lying on the ground, as leaves tend to do. Sometimes the wind would nudge it slightly, a little shuffle to the left, a little shuffle to the right. Then stillness again. One day a squirrel ran past the leaf. The squirrel did not eat the leaf. It did not take the leaf. It simply ran past, perhaps glancing at the leaf, perhaps not. It was hard to say. The leaf remained. Then, after many days, a gust of wind picked up the leaf and carried it just a little further down the path. Not too far, just enough to make it land in a slightly different place. It settled once more, pressing lightly into the earth. The sun warmed it during the day, and the cool air brushed against it at night. Occasionally a small insect would wander across its surface, pausing for a moment before moving along. The leaf did not mind. As time passed, other leaves began to fall. One landed nearby, and another, and another. Soon there were many leaves, resting together in quiet company. They did not talk. They did not move much. They were simply there. A gentle rain came. It dampened the leaves, darkening their colors for a while. Droplets gathered along their edges, then slid off, soaking into the soil below. The leaf felt heavier now. It did not mind. The rain passed and the sun returned. The leaf dried again. One afternoon a deer wandered through the forest. It stepped carefully, its hooves pressing into the soft earth. It paused near the leaf, sniffed the air, then continued on its way. The leaf remained. The wind returned, gathering strength one evening and stirring the leaves into motion. Some of them lifted slightly, skimming the ground before settling again. The leaf too was lifted, twirling gently before finding a new resting place only a short distance away. Not far, just enough to notice. The days grew cooler. The sunlight softened. The nights stretched longer. The leaf, once yellow, now faded further, its edges curling slightly inward. It was still a leaf, but it was changing, as leaves do. One morning, a child walked through the forest, their boots crunching softly against the path. They noticed the leaf, paused and bent down. For a moment, they traced its veins with a small finger. Then, With great care, they picked it up and turned it over. A moment of quiet examination. Then just as gently they placed it back where it had been. The leaf did not mind. More time passed. The forest continued its quiet rhythm. The trees swayed, the birds called, the wind whispered. The leaf listened. Little by little the leaf became part of the earth. It softened, it crumbled, it blended into the soil where it would help new things grow. It did not resist, it did not hurry. It simply became something else. In the spring, when the trees stretched their branches toward the sun, new leaves began to unfurl. Small, bright green, full of newness. They did not know about the leaf that had come before them, but it was still there, in a way, in the roots, in the soil, in the quiet rhythm of the forest. And that was all. Once upon a time, in the small and peaceful village of Bramblebrook, the townsfolk gathered for an important discussion. It was not about dragons, or lost princesses, or daring quest. No, it was about something far more pressing, the state of their pantries. For years the good people of Bramblebrook had kept their shelves in a reasonable, if somewhat haphazard manner. Bags of flour leaned against jars of honey. Tins of soup were tucked behind sacks of potatoes, and the occasional forgotten bundle of dried herbs lingered in shadowy corners. Though no one found this arrangement particularly troubling, there was a general sense that things could be better. And so on a cloudy Tuesday afternoon, the village council held a meeting to discuss the matter. It was decided unanimously that each household would take the time to reorganize their pantry shelves in a way that was practical, aesthetically pleasing, and above all logical. Some villagers chose to arrange their goods alphabetically, starting with almonds and ending with zucchini seeds. Others preferred to group by category, grains in one section, spices in another, and baking essentials neatly together. A few took the extra step of placing their most frequently used items at eye level for easy access. Mrs. Puddlewisk, the town's most diligent homemaker, took great pride in her work. She spent an entire day shifting flour into airtight jars, lining up her tins with meticulous precision, and making small, handwritten labels for every single item, even those that were unmistakable, such as sugar and salt. When asked if this effort was necessary, she simply nodded and continued adjusting the spacing between each jar until it was perfectly uniform. Meanwhile, old Mr. Fennel, whose pantry was mostly filled with tea, found great joy in sorting his collection by variety. He carefully stacked boxes of chamomile, peppermint, and Earl Grey in a way that created a pleasing gradient of color. Afterward, he stood back, admired his work, and brewed himself a cup of perfectly ordinary black tea. Little Timothy, who was given the task of helping his mother organize their shelves, took his role very seriously. He placed all the jars in order of size, then changed his mind and tried ordering them by weight. After much deliberation, he settled on arranging them in a pattern that he found pleasant to look at, when his mother gently suggested that it might be more practical to keep similar items together. Timothy nodded solemnly and started again. The process took several days, as some villagers became deeply absorbed in their work. Some households took the opportunity to sweep out their cupboards, marveling at the small amount of dust that had accumulated behind long-forgotten tins of beans. Others discovered that they owned duplicates of certain ingredients and made quiet mental notes not to buy more nutmeg for at least another year. By the end of the week, the village had completed its task. Shelves gleamed with orderliness, jars stood in neat, methodical rows, and everyone felt a mild but satisfying sense of accomplishment. No one's life had changed in any dramatic way, but there was an undeniable air of quiet contentment that settled over Bramblebrook, At the next village meeting, the townsfolk agreed that the reorganization had been a success. No parades were held, no songs were sung, but several people nodded approvingly. It was suggested that perhaps next season they might consider tidying up their garden sheds in a similarly efficient manner. And so life in Bramblebrook continued at its usual gentle pace, with everything in its rightful place, as it should be. Edwin the Mild was not known for doing anything particularly remarkable. It suited him just fine. He lived in a small cottage on the edge of the village of Wickerby, where the most notable event of the year was the annual counting of the ducks. One morning, Edwin decided it was time to visit the market, a journey of precisely 1 mile. He did not rush, for Edwin was never one to rush, and so he set out at a most reasonable pace, his boots making a soft, rhythmic sound against the packed dirt road. As he walked, he noticed the path beneath him. Some parts were smoother than others, some had small pebbles that shifted slightly underfoot. Every now and then, a tiny dip in the road would change the angle of his step, ever so slightly. He found this interesting in the mildest possible way. To his left, a field stretched out in quiet contentment. The grass was neither too long nor too short. A small collection of cows stood in the distance, neither particularly close nor remarkably far away. They were not doing much, simply standing, as cows often do. Edwin observed them for a moment, then continued walking. A gentle breeze passed through the air, neither strong nor absent, just enough to stir the leaves in the trees. Edwin liked the way they rustled softly, a sound that was neither intrusive nor particularly memorable, but pleasant all the same. About halfway to the market, Edwin came across a wooden fence that lined the road. He paused to examine it. The wood was weathered but still sturdy, and a small knot in one of the planks caught his attention. It was round and slightly darker than the rest of the wood. He considered the knot for a moment before moving on. As he approached the market, the faint scent of fresh bread drifted through the air. It was a simple, comforting smell. Edwin looked forward to purchasing a loaf. Perhaps he would also buy a small wedge of cheese. He thought about this possibility for several minutes. The market itself was neither bustling nor empty, just comfortably occupied with people selecting vegetables, discussing the mildness of the weather, and adjusting the straps of their baskets. Edwin selected his loaf of bread, which had a crust that was firm but not too firm. He decided, after a great deal of consideration, to also purchase the cheese. It was a reasonable choice. After completing his purchases, Edwin took the same path home. The cows were still there. The fence was still there. The wind had not changed much. The pebbles on the road were perhaps in slightly different places, though it was difficult to be sure. By the time he arrived back at his cottage, Edwin felt a small but satisfying sense of completion. He had set out on a walk, and now he had returned. The bread and cheese sat neatly on his table. He poured himself a glass of water, which was neither too cold nor too warm, and took a slow sip. It had been a very nice walk indeed. In a quiet cottage at the edge of the village of Thimblewick, on a sturdy wooden shelf, sat a teapot. It was a rather nice teapot, porcelain, white with a delicate blue pattern, its spout curved just so. It had a matching lid that fit perfectly, neither too snug nor too loose. This teapot had been in the cottage for many years. It had not been forgotten, nor had it been particularly cherished. It was simply there. Occasionally someone would move it slightly when dusting the shelf, or tilt it to check for dust inside, but it was never used. Miss Cartwright, who owned the cottage, was not opposed to tea. In fact, she quite liked tea, But she had a habit of using a simple mug and a tea bag, pouring hot water directly from the kettle, which was much quicker than using the teapot. The teapot, though perfectly functional, remained unused. Over the years, Miss Cartwright would sometimes look at the teapot and think, "Perhaps I should use that one day." But then she would continue with whatever she had been doing, and the thought would fade like steam from a cooling cup. Once a visitor came to the cottage and noticed the teapot. "That's a lovely teapot," they remarked. "Yes, it is," Miss Cartwright agreed. "Do you use it often?" "Oh, no, not really," she said. "I suppose I could, but I don't." The visitor nodded, and that was the end of the conversation. Seasons passed. The teapot remained on its shelf. Occasionally a sunbeam would fall upon it in the late afternoon, casting a gentle glow on the blue patterns. The effect was quite pleasant, though no one was there to take particular notice. One winter's day, Miss Cartwright considered making tea in the teapot. She stood by the shelf, looking at it for a long moment. She even lifted the lid, peering inside to confirm that, yes, it was still empty. But in the end, she simply boiled water and made tea in her mug, as always. The teapot was not disappointed, for teapots do not feel disappointment, nor was it particularly hopeful. For teapots do not feel hope. It simply remained where it was, unchanged, unbothered, and entirely at peace. And so many more years passed, and the teapot continued to sit, admired now and then, but never quite needed. And that was perfectly fine. Harold had a bedtime routine. It was not particularly exciting, nor was it particularly unusual, but it was in every way thorough. Every night, at precisely 9:30 p.m., Harold would rise from his chair, fold his newspaper with exacting care, and place it on the small table beside his armchair. He would run his hand over the surface of the paper, ensuring no pages stuck out unevenly. Then he would stand, stretch just enough to feel slightly looser, but not so much as to be dramatic, and proceed to the kitchen. In the kitchen, Harold would fill a glass with water. He would drink half of it, then place the remaining half on the nightstand by his bed. He had never once woken up needing the water, but it was good to have it there just in case. The glass always went in the same spot, 2 inches from the lamp, 3 inches from the edge of the table. He would pause for a moment, making sure it was positioned correctly, before moving on. Next, Harold would brush his teeth. He squeezed precisely the right amount of toothpaste onto his brush, not too little, not too much, and brushed with steady, methodical strokes. He counted to 30 for each section of his mouth. His right side first, then the left, then the front, then the back. After finishing, he inspected his reflection to make sure no toothpaste lingered at the corners of his mouth. He rinsed his mouth exactly 3 times, letting the water swirl before spitting it out. Then, as always, he wiped the sink with a clean, dry cloth, removing any stray drops of water. The cloth, once used, was folded neatly and placed back where it belonged. He would then turn to his hair, which, though sparse, deserved attention. He ran a comb through it 5 times, 3 strokes on the left, 2 on the right. Satisfied, he placed the comb back in its drawer, aligning it perfectly parallel to the edge of the drawer's interior. Then came the pajama ritual. Harold carefully buttoned his pajama shirt from bottom to top, ensuring each button aligned perfectly. He smoothed the fabric, making sure it sat just right. Then he turned back the covers of his bed, fluffing the pillow twice, once on each side, to ensure even distribution. He took a moment to examine the room. The curtains were drawn evenly, with no gaps. The chair by the window was pushed in properly. The book on his nightstand was placed exactly where he had left it. Satisfied, he proceeded. Finally, Harold would sit on the edge of the bed, take off his slippers, and place them precisely parallel to each other, their toes facing the door. He would adjust them slightly if needed, ensuring they were evenly spaced. He would then exhale a slow, measured breath and lie down. He would pull the covers up to his chest, ensuring that they were neither too tight nor too loose. Before turning off the lamp, he would reach for his alarm clock and check the time. It always read the same, as it always would, 9:57 p.m. He would nod to himself, reassured by the consistency. Then, with deliberate care, he would turn the alarm dial just to make sure it was set correctly. Not that it ever changed, but checking was part of the process. With the final step complete, Harold would turn off the lamp, plunging the room into a quiet, comforting darkness. He would close his eyes. He listened to the sounds of the night. Faint hum of the refrigerator down the hall, the gentle ticking of the clock on the wall, the occasional creak of the house settling. These were familiar sounds, predictable sounds, sounds that told Harold that everything was as it should be, and, without fail, Harold would fall asleep. The night passed, as nights tend to do. Harold did not toss and turn. He did not wake suddenly, startled by an unknown cause. His breath remained slow and steady, his body still. Morning would come as it always did, and Harold's routine would begin anew. In the quiet and well-organized kingdom of Evenmere, things were always done in a manner that was both sensible and practical. The people of Evenmere were known far and wide, not for bravery or grand adventures, but for their consistent ability to make reasonable decisions. At the heart of the kingdom sat King Leopold the Sensible, who had ruled for many years without scandal or excitement. His reign was neither prosperous nor troubled. It simply moved along at a steady, manageable pace. Every morning, the king would wake at a respectable hour, have a balanced breakfast of porridge with just the right amount of honey, and then sit down at his desk to review matters of the kingdom. One day a messenger arrived at the palace. He did not burst in dramatically, nor was he out of breath. He simply walked in at a measured pace and bowed politely. "Your Majesty, the people request guidance on the matter of candle usage. Some believe they should burn their candles for exactly 3 hours each evening, while others suggest 4. What shall be done?" King Leopold nodded thoughtfully. "Let us consider the needs of the people," he said. 3 hours may be sufficient for most, but 4 may be necessary for tasks requiring extra care. I propose a compromise. Let each household determine their own candle usage based on their needs, provided they do not waste wax unnecessarily. The messenger bowed. "A wise decision, Your Majesty." And so the people of Evenmere continued to use candles in a practical manner, and no further issues arose on the matter. Another time, a farmer came to the king with a dilemma. "Your Majesty, my field produces a fair amount of wheat, not too much, not too little. My neighbor suggests I plant more, but I worry I may not have the space. What should I do?" King Leopold considered this carefully. "How much room do you have?" "A reasonable amount," the farmer replied. "How much wheat do you need?" "Enough to last through winter with some extra for trade." "Then I suggest you plant only what your land can comfortably support. If you find you need more, you may expand gradually." The farmer nodded. "That is very sensible. Thank you, Your Majesty." And so, the farmer planted a reasonable amount of wheat, neither too much nor too little, and was content with his decision. The kingdom continued in this way for many years. When disputes arose, they were handled with calm discussions and practical solutions. When a new bridge was needed, it was built in a timely manner, with neither haste nor delay. When roads needed repairing, they were repaired efficiently, but without unnecessary flourishes. Even the kingdom's festivals were pleasant, but not overly extravagant. There were small cakes, but not too many. There was music, but not too loud. People danced, but only for an appropriate amount of time before heading home at a respectable hour. One day, a visiting noble from a neighboring land arrived at court. He had heard of Evenmere's reputation for reasonable decisions and wished to see it for himself. "Tell me, your Majesty," the noble asked, "what do you do when faced with a great dilemma?" King Leopold took a measured sip of tea before replying. "We think carefully, we weigh the options, and then we do what seems best for everyone involved." The noble nodded. "And has this method served you well?" "Quite well," the king said. "We have never had unnecessary wars, nor have we had needless suffering. Our people are neither too rich nor too poor. We are not the most remarkable kingdom, but we are comfortable." The noble considered this and found it agreeable. He stayed for a while observing how Evenmere functioned, and found that it was indeed a very practical place. And so the kingdom of Evenmere continued on, with well-maintained roads, reasonably portioned meals, and decisions that were always, in every way, entirely sensible. Gerald had a missing sock. It was not a particularly special sock, just a plain grey one, with a modest amount of elasticity. It was neither too thick nor too thin, and it fit his foot in a way that was perfectly acceptable. And yet, when he finished folding his laundry one Tuesday afternoon, the sock was not there. Gerald was not alarmed. Socks sometimes disappeared, though he was not quite sure how. He searched the laundry basket, lifting each remaining item carefully. He shook out his shirts, examined the insides of his trouser legs, and even checked beneath the bed, though he had no memory of dropping a sock there. Still the sock remained missing. He sighed, not out of frustration, but in a way that suggested mild resignation. "I suppose I will have to find it eventually," he murmured to himself, folding the remaining sock and setting it aside. The next day, Gerald checked the washing machine. It was empty except for a single stray thread that was not his. He closed the lid and nodded thoughtfully. At breakfast, he considered his options. He could wear a mismatched sock, but that idea did not appeal to him. He could buy a new pair, but that felt unnecessary when he already had the one. "Perhaps it will turn up," he said aloud, and no one was there to hear him. Throughout the week, Gerald checked in reasonable places. He looked inside his shoes, though he never put socks away in his shoes. He checked the space between the dresser and the wall, where things sometimes fell, but there was nothing there except a small amount of dust. He even opened the linen cupboard on the off chance that the sock had found its way inside by mistake. It had not. Days passed, the sock did not return. Gerald adjusted to this new reality with relative ease. He placed the lone sock in his drawer, folding it neatly despite its missing partner. He continued on with his life much as he had before, his days filled with routine and quiet contentment. Weeks later, as he pulled out a winter coat for the season, Gerald reached into the sleeve and found something soft against his fingertips. He withdrew his hand, and to his mild satisfaction, there was the sock. "Ah," he said, nodding, "that makes sense." He reunited the sock with its partner in the drawer, folding them together once more, and with that, the matter was settled. Mr. Inkwell's stationery shop was a place of quiet predictability. It sat on the corner of a modest street, neither too busy nor too empty, and had a small, clean window where a neatly lettered sign read, "Inkwell and Company Fine Stationery." Every morning at precisely 8:45, Mr. Inkwell would arrive. He was never late, nor was he ever early. He would pause outside the door, adjusting the cuffs of his neatly pressed shirt, before unlocking the door with a key that was always kept in the exact same pocket of his vest. The key fit smoothly into the lock, turning without resistance, and the door would swing open with the faintest of creaks, a sound that was so familiar to Mr. Inkwell that he no longer noticed it. Upon entering, he would take a moment to stand in the doorway surveying the shop. Everything was, as expected, in its proper place. Shelves stood straight and tidy, the glass display case was free of smudges, and the rows of ink bottles caught the soft morning light filtering through the window. Satisfied, he would step inside fully, ensuring that the door closed properly behind him. His first task was always the same. He would take a moment to straighten the stack of ledgers on the counter, even if they had not moved since the day before. Each ledger was aligned perfectly, their spines creating a uniform line. Then he would dust the shelves, though there was rarely enough dust to make a difference. He believed in the importance of maintenance, of keeping things in good order even when no one was watching. The shop was well stocked but never cluttered. There were shelves of notebooks in muted colours, each arranged by size, from the largest hardbound ledgers to the smallest pocket-sized journals. Stacks of fine writing paper sat in neat piles, each tied with a ribbon to indicate their weight and texture. Rows of ink bottles arranged with precision displayed varying shades of blue and black. Occasionally a customer would ask about green ink, and Mr. Inkwell would politely explain that, while green was certainly a respectable colour, he had found that most people preferred blue or black. At precisely 10:30 the postman would arrive. Mr. Inkwell knew the sound of his footsteps before he reached the door. The postman always knocked twice before stepping inside, and he carried a small bundle of letters, mostly invoices and the occasional request for a special order. Mr. Inkwell would receive them with a polite nod, then retire to his desk to read them carefully, nodding now and then, before placing them in an orderly pile. Each invoice was sorted by priority, with the most urgent placed at the top of the stack, though none were ever truly urgent. In afternoons, a few regular customers would stop by. Mr. Thompson, a retired schoolteacher, would inspect the fountain pens with great deliberation, picking up each one, testing its weight in his hand, and examining the nib with practiced care. Though he always ended up choosing the same model, he took his time in deciding, as though each visit required a fresh evaluation. Mr. Inkwell never rushed him. Miss Harper, a quiet woman with a fondness for fine paper, would enter with a soft smile and a nod, moving slowly to the shelves where the envelopes were kept. She would purchase a single envelope at a time, as though savouring each one before moving on to the next. Sometimes she would run her fingers lightly over the surface of the paper before making her selection. Mr. Inkwell never questioned her method. He simply wrapped her purchase with care and accepted her payment, always given an exact change. On slower days, Mr. Inkwell would take out a notebook and test the pens himself. He would write out neat sentences about the weather, or copy a passage from a book, his penmanship precise and controlled. It was not a necessity, but he found the act satisfying. He would then blot the ink carefully, closing the notebook with a quiet sense of completion. At precisely 5, he would close the shop. The process was as methodical as the opening. He would straighten the ledgers once more, dust the shelves again, and step outside to lock the door. He would listen for the soft click of the lock, ensuring it was properly secured, before slipping the key back into his vest pocket. As he walked home, he would think about the day, which had been much like the one before, and much like the one that would come next. The streets were quiet at this hour, the lamps just beginning to flicker to life. He would pass the bakery, where the scent of bread still lingered, and the tailor's shop, where a neatly dressed mannequin stood in the window. Everything was as it should be. And so the stationery shop remained quietly and contentedly unchanged. Mrs. Pottifer's garden was neither the grandest nor the smallest in the village. It was a perfectly respectable size, with a neat little path running through the middle, and flower beds arranged in a most sensible manner. Every morning, just as the sun was beginning to warm the earth, Mrs. Pottifer would step outside with her gardening gloves, a small trowel, and a watering can that was always filled to just the right level, never too heavy to carry, but never so empty as to be insufficient. She would start by checking on the marigolds. They were always quite sturdy, but she liked to make sure they weren't growing too wildly. A small trim here and there kept them in order. Next, she would inspect the petunias, which had a tendency to lean slightly to one side. She would gently pat the soil around them, just enough to remind them to stand up straight. The lavender bushes were her pride and joy, not because they were especially remarkable, but because they were consistent. They grew just as she expected them to. Never too much, never too little. When she brushed her fingers across them, a faint scent of lavender would linger in the air for a moment before fading away. After tending to the flowers, Mrs. Pottifer would move on to the vegetable patch. The carrots were coming along well, their green tops standing upright in a manner that suggested steady progress. The lettuces, too, were growing at a comfortable pace. She ran her fingers over their leaves, appreciating their cool, crisp texture. Weeds, of course, were inevitable, but they were not particularly troublesome. Pottifer would kneel down, pull them up with a steady, deliberate motion, and place them in a small basket. She did not mind the task. It was neither too difficult nor too dull. It simply was. After watering each plant with care, she would stand back and survey her work. The garden looked much the same as it had before, but slightly tidier, slightly more at ease. Satisfied, she would dust off her gloves, carry her tools back to the shed, and head inside for a cup of tea. And so it went, day after day, season after season. The flowers grew, the vegetables ripened, and Mrs. Pottifer tended to them, neither in haste nor in idleness, but in the steady, predictable rhythm of a well-kept garden. Arthur took the same evening walk every day at precisely the same time. It was not a long walk, nor was it particularly scenic, but it suited him. He left his house at exactly 6:45, locking the door with a firm but unhurried motion, and stepped onto the sidewalk with the same steady pace he always used. The walk took him along a quiet street lined with modest houses, each with a neatly trimmed lawn and a driveway that was neither too full nor too empty. Some houses had lights in their windows, casting a soft glow against the early evening sky. Others remained dark, their occupants perhaps watching television or reading quietly inside. Arthur always paused at the corner where the bakery used to be. It had closed many years ago, but he still remembered the smell of fresh bread that used to drift onto the street. Now the building housed an insurance office. He did not need insurance at the moment, but he supposed it was a perfectly reasonable use for the space. Continuing on, he passed the post office. He did not have any letters to send today, but he glanced at the red postbox out of habit. Sometimes there would be a person dropping in a letter, but tonight there was no one. The next stretch of his walk took him past a row of trees that were spaced at even intervals. Arthur found the spacing agreeable. He noted that the leaves were just beginning to change color, subtle hints of yellow at the edges. In another few weeks, they would fall, as they always did. He reached the small park at the end of the street and took his usual seat on the second bench from the left. He sat for exactly 5 minutes, neither looking at anything in particular, nor thinking about anything of great significance. The air was cool, but not cold. Occasionally a gentle breeze moved through the branches of the trees. At precisely 7:15, Arthur stood up, brushed a speck of dust from his coat, and began the walk back. The return journey was much the same as the first, though now more houses had their lights on. The postbox remained unattended. The insurance office was still there. When he arrived home, Arthur unlocked the door with the same firm but unhurried motion, stepped inside, and placed his coat on the same hook as always. The evening had gone exactly as expected, and so Arthur continued his walks day after day in the quiet and predictable rhythm of the world around him. The curtain in Eleanor's sitting room moved gently in the breeze. It was not a dramatic movement, nor a particularly insistent one, but rather a slow and measured sway, just enough to catch the eye without demanding attention. It had been this way for as long as she could remember, for she always left the window open, just a crack, to allow the air to circulate. The curtain itself was a pale cream colour, neither too bright nor too dull. It was made of a light woven fabric, soft to the touch, but not overly delicate. Eleanor had chosen it many years ago, after considering several similar options, and had never found any reason to replace it. It hung neatly, falling in even folds, except when the breeze disturbed it, shifting it slightly out of place before allowing it to settle again. Each afternoon, as she sat in her chair with her book, Eleanor would glance up now and then, watching the slow, rhythmic motion of the fabric. It was a small, simple thing, but she found it rather pleasant. The movement was never hurried, never chaotic, just a soft flutter, a gentle billow, a return to stillness. Sometimes the light coming through the window would change, and the curtain would glow faintly, casting subtle patterns of shadow on the floor. Eleanor would take a sip of tea, observing how the fabric caught the golden afternoon light. The warmth of the sun would come and go as the curtain shifted, never too bright, never too dim. Occasionally a stronger gust of wind would move through the room, lifting the curtain just a bit higher before allowing it to fall again. Eleanor would pause, waiting for the motion to settle before returning to her reading. Time passed in this way, measured not by great events, but by the quiet, steady repetition of small moments. The curtain moved, the sun shifted, the tea grew cooler. The day went on. In the evenings, as Eleanor prepared for bed, she would approach the window and carefully pull the curtain closed. It would fall into place without resistance, its movement as gentle as ever, and in the morning she would draw it open once more, allowing the cycle to begin again. Once upon a time, in a quiet little valley nestled between two gently sloping hills, there lay a pebble. This pebble was not particularly large, nor was it particularly small. It was not shiny, nor was it especially dull. It was, in fact, the most ordinary pebble you could ever imagine. It had been sitting in the same spot for as long as anyone could remember, and it was quite content with its lot in life. The pebble's days were spent doing very little. It would watch the grass sway in the breeze, listen to the distant chirping of birds, and occasionally feel the warmth of the sun on its smooth surface. Sometimes a beetle would crawl over it, or a drop of rain would land on it. But these events were rare and fleeting. Mostly the pebble just sat there, enjoying the quiet. One day a small snail happened upon the pebble. The snail was also quite ordinary, with a shell that was neither too dark nor too light, and a pace that was neither too fast nor too slow. The snail looked at the pebble and said, "Hello there, Pebble. You seem like a very nice pebble. Would you mind if I rested here for a while?" The pebble, who had never been asked such a question before, was delighted. "Of course, Snail," it replied. "You're welcome to rest here for as long as you like." So the snail settled down on the pebble, and the two of them spent the afternoon together. The snail told the pebble about its travels, which were not very exciting, but the pebble found them fascinating nonetheless. The pebble, in turn, told the snail about all the things it had seen from its spot in the valley, which were not very many, but the snail found them quite interesting. As the sun began to set, the snail decided it was time to move on. "Thank you for letting me rest here, Pebble," it said. "You are a very good pebble." The pebble felt a warm glow inside. It couldn't quite explain why. "You are welcome, Snail," it said. "I hope you have a safe journey." And with that, the snail slowly made its way down the hill, leaving the pebble alone once more. The pebble watched the snail go, feeling a little sad, but also a little happy. It had made a friend, even if only for a short while. That night, as the stars twinkled above, the pebble thought about the snail and the stories it had told. It wondered where the snail was now, and if it would ever return. But mostly, the pebble just enjoyed the quiet of the night, the soft rustling of the grass, and the gentle warmth of the earth beneath it. And so the pebble continued to sit in its spot, day after day, year after year, content with its simple, uneventful life. And if you were to visit that quiet little valley, you might just see the pebble there, still sitting, still watching, still enjoying the quiet. In a faraway kingdom there lived a princess named Somnia. Princess Somnia was known throughout the land for her love of sleep. She slept more than any other princess in history, and she was very proud of this fact. Her castle was filled with the softest pillows, the coziest blankets, and the most comfortable beds anyone had ever seen. Princess Somnia's days were spent in a state of perpetual drowsiness. She would wake up late in the morning, yawn, and then immediately begin planning her next nap. Her servants would bring her warm milk and honey, which she would sip slowly before drifting off to sleep once more. One day, as Princess Somnia was preparing for her afternoon nap, she noticed that her favorite pillow was looking a little flat. "Oh dear," she said, yawning, "this simply won't do. I must have the fluffiest pillow in all the land." And so Princess Somnia summoned her most trusted servant, a young man named Lethan, who was known for his ability to find the most comfortable sleeping materials. "Lethan," she said, "I need you to find me a new pillow. It must be the fluffiest, softest, most comfortable pillow in the entire kingdom." Lethan nodded and set off on his quest. He travelled far and wide, visiting every pillow maker in the land. He tested hundreds of pillows, fluffing them, squeezing them, and even lying down on them to see how they felt, but none of them were quite right. Finally, after many days of searching, Lethan came across a small village where an old woman was known to make the most wonderful pillows. He entered her shop and was immediately struck by the softness of the air. The old woman smiled and handed him a pillow. "This," she said, "is the pillow you are looking for." Lethan took the pillow and immediately knew it was perfect. It was soft yet firm, fluffy yet supportive. He thanked the old woman and hurried back to the castle. When Princess Somnia saw the pillow, her eyes lit up with joy. "Oh, Lethan," she said, "this is exactly what I needed. You have done well." And with that, Princess Somnia lay down on her new pillow and fell into the deepest, most peaceful sleep she had ever known. She slept for days, and then weeks, and then months. The kingdom grew quiet, and the people began to whisper that perhaps Princess Somnia would never wake up. But Princess Somnia didn't mind. She was happy, dreaming of soft clouds and gentle breezes. And if you were to visit the castle today, you might just see her there, still sleeping, still dreaming, still content. In a quiet meadow, there lived a tortoise named Tilly and a snail named Sam. Tilly and Sam were the best of friends, though they didn't do much together. They both enjoyed moving very slowly, and they both appreciated the simple things in life, like the feel of the sun on their shells and the sound of the wind in the grass. One day, Tilly and Sam decided to go on a journey. They didn't have a particular destination in mind. They just wanted to see what they could see. "We'll take our time," Tilly said. "There's no rush." And so they set off. They moved at a pace that was so slow, it was almost imperceptible. They would take a few steps, then stop to admire a flower or a blade of grass. They would chat about the weather or the quality of the soil or the color of the sky. Then they would take a few more steps. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Tilly and Sam didn't mind. They were in no hurry. They enjoyed the journey, and they enjoyed each other's company. They would often stop to take naps or to simply sit and watch the world go by. One day, after many months of traveling, Tilly and Sam came across a small stream. The water was clear and cool, and it sparkled in the sunlight. "This is a lovely spot," Tilly said. "Let's rest here for a while." And so they did. They sat by the stream, listening to the gentle babbling of the water, feeling the cool breeze on their shells. They didn't speak, they didn't need to. They were content just to be there. in that moment, enjoying the peace and quiet. As the sun began to set, Tilly turned to Sam and said, "You know, Sam, I think we've reached our destination." Sam nodded. "I think you're right, Tilly. This is a good place to be." And so Tilly and Sam decided to stay by the stream. They built a small home out of leaves and twigs, and they spent their days doing what they loved most, moving slowly, enjoying the simple things, and appreciating the beauty of the world around them. And if you were to visit that quiet meadow today, you might just see Tilly and Sam there, still sitting by the stream, still moving slowly, still enjoying the journey. In a quiet little forest there lived a bunny named Bernard. Bernard was a very boring bunny. He didn't like to hop or play or do anything exciting. Instead, he spent his days hosting tea parties for himself. Bernard's tea parties were always the same. He would set out a small table with a lace tablecloth, a teapot, and a single teacup. He would brew a pot of chamomile tea, which he would sip slowly while staring off into the distance. Sometimes he would invite a friend to join him, but most of the time he preferred to be alone. One day, as Bernard was setting up for his afternoon tea party, he noticed that his teapot was looking a little old and worn. "Oh dear," he said, "this simply won't do. I must have the most boring teapot in all the land." And so Bernard set off on a quest to find a new teapot. He visited every shop in the forest, but none of the teapots were quite right. They were all too colourful or too fancy or too interesting. Bernard wanted a teapot that was plain and simple, with no frills or decorations. Finally, after many days of searching, Bernard came across a small, dusty shop at the edge of the forest. Inside, he found the perfect teapot. It was plain white, with no designs or patterns. It was exactly what Bernard was looking for. He bought the teapot and hurried back to his home. He set it on the table, poured himself a cup of tea, and sat down to enjoy his tea party. As he sipped his tea, he felt a sense of contentment wash over him. This was exactly what he needed. And so Bernard continued to host his tea parties day after day, year after year. He never grew tired of them, and he never wanted anything more. He was happy with his simple, boring life, and he wouldn't have it any other way. And if you were to visit that quiet little forest today, you might just see Bernard there, still sipping his tea, still staring off into the distance, still enjoying his endless tea party. In a quiet little village, there lived a shepherd named Silas. Silas was known throughout the village for his love of sleep. He would often fall asleep while tending to his sheep, and his flock would wander off, only to return on their own when they were ready. Silas didn't mind. He enjoyed the peace and quiet of the countryside, and he loved the feeling of the warm sun on his face as he dozed off in the grass. His sheep were well behaved, and they always came back when they were ready, so Silas saw no reason to worry. One day, as Silas was lying in the grass, watching the clouds drift by, he noticed that one of his sheep was missing. "Oh dear," he said, yawning. "Suppose I should go look for it." And so Silas set off on a slow, leisurely search for his missing sheep. He walked through the fields, calling out the sheep's name in a soft, soothing voice. He didn't rush. There was no need. He knew the sheep would turn up eventually. As he walked, Silas began to feel sleepy. The sun was warm, the grass was soft, and the breeze was gentle. He found a nice spot under a tree and decided to take a nap. "I'll look for the sheep later," he thought, as he drifted off to sleep. Silas woke up. The sun was setting and the sheep was standing next to him, chewing on a blade of grass. "Oh, there you are," Silas said, yawning. "I was wondering where you'd gone." The sheep didn't respond, but Silas didn't mind. He was just happy to have his flock back together. He gathered his sheep and slowly made his way back to the village, enjoying the peace and quiet of the evening. And so Silas continued to tend to his sheep day after day, year after year. He never worried about them wandering off, and he never rushed to find them. He knew they would always come back, and he was content to let them roam. And if you were to visit that quiet little village today, you might just see Silas there, still tending to his sheep, still dozing off in the grass, still enjoying the never-ending story of his sleepy life. Once upon a time, in a village neither too big nor too small, there lived a man named Harold the Mild. Harold was known for being neither too fast nor too slow, neither too quiet nor too loud, and neither too interesting nor too dull. He lived in a house that was painted a colour that could only be described as quite beige, and he enjoyed eating oatmeal that was neither too hot nor too cold. One day, Harold decided he should go for a walk. It was not a special day, nor was it a particularly uneventful one. It was simply the kind of day that existed, much like the day before, quite possibly like the day after. Harold put on his shoes, first the left, then the right, as was his habit, and stepped outside. The sky was the exact shade of grey that suggested neither sunshine nor rain, but the possibility of both, or perhaps neither. He walked past the baker's shop, where the bread smelled faintly of flour and yeast, though not in an overwhelming way. He walked past the cobbler's shop, where a shoe sat in the window, unchanged since the last time he had walked past. He nodded at Mr. Bickley, who was sweeping his porch at a pace best described as deliberate. "Morning," Harold said. "Morning," said Mr. Bickley. And then Harold continued walking. Harold walked down the path that led out of the village and into the meadow. The grass there was neither too tall nor too short, swaying gently in the breeze, but only just. The dirt path was well worn, but not too worn. Small pebbles arranged in an entirely ordinary way. Harold stepped carefully, but not too carefully, as he continued forward at a steady pace. After a while he reached a crossroads. To the left, the path led toward a gentle stream, where the water moved at a speed best described as consistent. To the right, the path led toward the old oak tree, which had stood in that very spot for longer than anyone cared to remember. Harold took a moment to consider. Then, without any rush, he decided to sit on a nearby rock. He sat for a good while. Eventually, Harold decided he had sat long enough. He rose, dusted off his trousers, and continued his walk, choosing the path toward the stream. The water moved as expected, and Harold watched it for some time. Then he turned around and walked home. It was a good walk. Once upon a time, in a small but not particularly notable town, there lived a woman named Matilda. Matilda had a routine that she followed quite precisely, though not rigidly. She enjoyed a cup of tea in the morning, a light lunch in the afternoon, and, on some occasions, a second cup of tea in the evening. On this particular afternoon, Matilda found herself considering whether she ought to go outside. The sky was a pale blue, with a few clouds that moved at a pace neither hurried nor sluggish. The temperature was pleasantly mild, with just enough warmth to make a shawl unnecessary, but not quite enough to feel particularly warm. Matilda eventually stood up from her chair, smoothing her dress with her hands. She walked to the front door, reached for the handle, and turned it at a pace that could only be described as unhurried. The door opened, revealing the outside, which looked exactly as she expected it to. She stepped out and took a deep breath. The air smelled faintly of nothing in particular, though if she concentrated, she thought she could detect a distant scent of baking bread. She began walking, not quickly, but also not particularly slowly. Her shoes made a faint sound against the cobbled street, a sound that was neither unpleasant nor particularly interesting. As she strolled, she noticed Mr. Thompson standing outside his shop, adjusting a small sign that read, "Fresh goods sold here." He nodded at her. She nodded back. A cat sat on the low wall. It was an ordinary cat, with fur that was not quite white and not quite grey, but something in between. The cat blinked. Matilda blinked. Then she continued walking. She reached the town square, where the fountain was still gurgling at its usual rate. A pigeon was drinking from the edge. Another pigeon was standing nearby, doing nothing in particular. Matilda sat on a bench. She sat for some time. Eventually she stood up. She walked home with the same pace she had left. When she arrived, she closed the door, removed her shoes, and sat in her chair. It had been a fine afternoon, not too exciting, but not too dull either. She thought for a brief moment that she might like another cup of tea, and so she made one. Once in a land neither far nor near, there lived a man named Bernard. Bernard was a patient man, known for taking his time in all things. If there was a line, he stood in it. If there was a chair, he sat in it. If there was a moment to be had, he had it at his own pace. One morning Bernard decided he ought to visit his friend, who lived in the next village over. It was a journey that took approximately an hour if one walked briskly, but Bernard did not believe in walking briskly unless it was absolutely necessary. And so he set out, placing one foot in front of the other with a consistency that could only be described as moderate. The road stretched ahead of him in a way that was neither particularly winding nor especially straight. The trees along the way were spaced evenly apart, casting shadows that were of reasonable length. Bernard walked, appreciating the feel of the road beneath his feet, the air around him, and the general sense of moving forward without undue haste. He passed a wooden fence that had stood for many years, and he noted that it continued to stand, much as it had before. A bird chirped in a tree, and Bernard paused to listen. The chirping was neither especially loud nor especially quiet. It was just there. He resumed walking. After some time, neither too much nor too little, he reached a small bridge over a very calm stream. He stopped to lean on the railing, gazing at the water below. It flowed gently, without urgency, over smooth stones that had been there for as long as Bernard could recall. He watched for a while. Then, feeling satisfied, he continued his journey. Eventually he arrived at his friend's house. He knocked exactly 3 times, waited, then knocked once more for good measure. His friend opened the door. "Ah, Bernard," he said, "you've arrived." "Indeed," Bernard replied. They sat together, drinking tea. It was neither too strong nor too weak, and the conversation was pleasant in an entirely predictable way. After some time, Bernard stood up. "I suppose I should be going," he said. His friend nodded. "A wise choice." And so Bernard left, walking home at the same pace he had come. The trees still stood. That remained. The stream continued flowing. It was, all things considered, a very fine day. Once upon a time, in a quiet little village, nestled between 2 gently rolling hills, there was a pebble. This pebble was not particularly special. It was not the shiniest pebble, nor the smoothest, nor the largest. It was just a pebble, about the size of a button, with a faint greyish hue that blended seamlessly into the dirt path it called home. The pebble had lived on this path for as long as it could remember. It had seen countless feet pass by, boots, shoes, bare feet, and even the occasional paw. But no one ever stopped to notice the pebble. It was just there, part of the scenery, like the blades of grass that swayed lazily in the breeze, or the occasional dandelion that sprouted up in the spring. One day, after a particularly uneventful morning, a light rain began to fall. The pebble felt the first drops land on its surface, cool and refreshing. The rain continued softly and steadily until a small puddle began to form right next to the pebble. The puddle was shallow, no more than a few inches deep, and it shimmered faintly as the raindrops rippled its surface. The pebble and the puddle existed side by side for a while, neither paying much attention to the other. The puddle was busy reflecting the grey sky above, while the pebble was content to just lie there, feeling the rain wash over it. But as the hours passed, the pebble began to notice something peculiar. The puddle was growing, slowly but surely, inching closer and closer to the pebble. By late afternoon, the puddle had grown large enough to touch the pebble. At first it was just a gentle lapping, like the puddle was testing the waters, so to speak. But as the rain continued, the puddle grew bolder, enveloping the pebble in its cool, shallow embrace. The pebble didn't mind. In fact, it found the sensation quite pleasant. The water softened the edges of the pebble, smoothing out its rough spots and making it feel almost new. The puddle, for its part, seemed to enjoy the company. It rippled softly around the pebble as if whispering secrets only the two of them could understand. As the evening wore on, the rain finally began to taper off. The puddle, now at its fullest, reflected the first stars of the night. The pebble, still nestled in the puddle's embrace, felt a sense of contentment it had never known before. It wasn't an exciting life, but it was a peaceful one, and that was enough. Eventually the puddle began to shrink as the water slowly seeped into the ground. The pebble, now smooth and slightly damp, was left alone once more, but it didn't feel lonely. It knew that the next time it rained, the puddle would return, and they would share another quiet, uneventful day together. And so the pebble and the puddle continued their slow, monotonous existence, day after day, season after season. The villagers still walked by, never noticing the pebble or the puddle, but that was just fine. The pebble and the puddle didn't need anyone else. They had each other, and that was all they needed. In a small, dusty cupboard, in a small, dusty kitchen, there lived a teacup. This teacup was not particularly remarkable. It was plain white, with a small chip on its rim and a faint crack running down one side. It had been in the cupboard for as long as it could remember, surrounded by other teacup saucers and the occasional mismatched plate. Teacup's life was uneventful, to say the least. It spent most of its time sitting on the shelf, waiting for something to happen, but nothing ever did. The cupboard door would open occasionally, and a hand would reach in to grab a plate or a bowl, but the teacup was always left behind. It wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the chip, or the crack, or maybe it was just too plain to be noticed. One day, after what felt like an eternity of waiting, the cupboard door opened, and the hand reached in. But this time, instead of grabbing a plate or a bowl, the hand hesitated. It hovered over the teacups, as if trying to decide which one to choose. The teacup held its breath. Not that it could actually breathe, but you know what I mean. As the hand moved closer and closer. And then, to its astonishment, the hand picked it up. The teacup was filled with a mixture of excitement and dread as it was carried out of the cupboard and into the kitchen. It had never been used before, and it wasn't sure what to expect. Would it be filled with hot tea? Cold tea? Would it be dropped? Would it break? But none of those things happened. Instead, the hand placed the teacup on the counter and left it there. The teacup sat there for what felt like hours, watching as the sunlight slowly moved across the kitchen floor. He could hear the faint sounds of the house, the ticking of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the floorboards, but no one came back for the teacup. Eventually the hand returned. It picked up the teacup again, but instead of filling it with tea, it placed it in a box with some other dishes. The box was taped shut, and the teacup was plunged into darkness. It wasn't sure what was happening, but it knew one thing: its life was about to change. The box was carried out of the house and loaded into a car. The teacup could feel the vibrations as the car started and began to move. It wasn't sure where it was going, but it didn't really matter. It was just glad to be out of the cupboard. The car ride was long and uneventful. The teacup could hear the faint hum of the engine and the occasional sound of other cars passing by, but otherwise it was quiet. It didn't know how long it had been in the car, but eventually the car came to a stop, and the box was carried out. The teacup was placed in a new cupboard, this one just as dusty as the old one. It was surrounded by new dishes, but they were just as plain, unremarkable as the ones it had left behind. The teacup sighed again, not that it could actually sigh, and settled in for another long, uneventful wait. But this time, it was different. This time, the teacup knew that it had been chosen. It had been taken out of the cupboard even if it hadn't been used. And that gave it hope. Maybe, just maybe, one day it would be filled with tea. And until then, it would wait patiently and quietly in its new cupboard. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. The teacup remained in its new cupboard, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The cupboard door would open occasionally, and a hand would reach in to grab a plate or a bowl, but the teacup was always left behind. It wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the chip, or the crack, or maybe it was just too plain to be noticed. But the teacup didn't mind. It had been chosen once, and that was enough. It knew that one day it would be chosen again. And so the teacup waited. It waited as the sunlight moved across the kitchen floor, as the clock ticked away the hours, as the refrigerator hummed softly in the background. It waited as the seasons changed, as the leaves fell from the trees and the snow covered the ground. It waited as the days grew longer and the nights grew shorter, as the flowers bloomed and the birds returned. It waited patiently and quietly for the day when it would be filled with tea, and until then, it was content to just sit there in its dusty cupboard, surrounded by other plain and unremarkable dishes, because sometimes the most uneventful lives are the most peaceful ones. And Teacup was at peace. And so the teacup's journey continued, day after day, year after year. It was never filled with tea, but it didn't mind. It had been chosen once, and that was enough. It knew that one day it would be chosen again, and until then it would wait patiently and quietly in its dusty cupboard, because sometimes the most uneventful lives are the most peaceful ones, and the teacup was at peace. In a small, quiet room at the end of a long, narrow hallway, there stood a bookshelf. This bookshelf was not particularly grand or imposing. It was made of plain, unfinished wood, with 4 shelves that were slightly warped from years of use. The bookshelf was old, but it was sturdy, and it had been in the room for as long as anyone could remember. The bookshelf was filled with books, but they were not the kind of books that anyone would rush to read. They were old, dusty, and mostly forgotten. There were textbooks from decades past, novels with yellowed pages, and a few mystery books with cracked spines. The bookshelf didn't mind. It was just happy to have something to hold. The room itself was quiet, with only the occasional sound of footsteps passing by in the hallway. The bookshelf spent most of its time standing there, holding its books, and watching as the sunlight moved across the floor. It wasn't an exciting life, but it was a peaceful one. One day, after what felt like an eternity of standing in the same spot, the door to the room opened. A person walked in, carrying a box. The bookshelf watched as the person set the box down and began to unpack it. Inside the box were more books, old, dusty, and mostly forgotten, just like the ones already on the shelves. The person began to place the new books on the shelves, one by one. The bookshelf felt a sense of satisfaction as each book was added. It wasn't sure why, but it liked the feeling of being full, having their purpose.
The person who say anything as they worked, bookshelf didn't mind.
Just happy to have more books to hold. When the box was empty, the person left the room, closing the door behind them. The bookshelf was alone again, but it didn't feel lonely. It had its books, and that was enough. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. The bookshelf continued to stand in the same spot, holding its books and watching as the sunlight moved across the floor. The door to the room would open occasionally, and a person would walk in to add more books to the shelves. But most of the time, the bookshelf was alone. It wasn't an exciting life, but it was a peaceful one, and the bookshelf was content. Years passed, and the bookshelf remained in the same spot, holding its books and watching as the sunlight moved across the floor. The books on its shelves grew dustier and more forgotten, but the bookshelf didn't mind. It was just happy to have something to hold. One day, after what felt like an eternity of standing in the same spot, the door to the room opened again. This time, a different person walked in. They were carrying a box, but it wasn't filled with books. Instead, it was filled with small, delicate objects, figurines, trinkets, and other knickknacks. The person began to place the objects on the shelves, one by one. The bookshelf felt a sense of curiosity as each object was added. It wasn't sure what they were, but it liked the feeling of having something new to hold. The person didn't say anything as they worked, and the bookshelf didn't mind. It was just happy to have more things to hold. When the box was empty, the person left the room, closing the door behind them. The bookshelf was alone again, but it didn't feel lonely. It had its books and its new objects, and that was enough. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. The bookshelf continued to stand in the same spot, holding its books and objects and watching as the sunlight moved across the floor. The door to the room would open occasionally, and a person would walk in to add more books or objects to the shelves. But most of the time, the bookshelf was alone. It wasn't an exciting life, but it was a peaceful one, and the bookshelf was content. And so the bookshelf's journey continued, day after day, year after year. It was never moved, never cleaned, and never noticed. But it didn't mind. It had its books and its objects, and that was enough, because sometimes the most uneventful lives are the most peaceful ones. And the bookshelf was at peace. In a small, unremarkable living room, on a wall painted a color that could only be described as beige, there hung a picture frame. This frame was not particularly ornate or eye-catching. It was made of plain wood, stained a medium brown, and it held a photograph of a field. The field was not particularly interesting either, just a stretch of grass with a few scattered wildflowers and a single tree in the distance, kind of field you might drive past without a second thought. The picture frame had hung on this wall for years, slightly crooked. No one had ever bothered to straighten it. It wasn't crooked enough to be noticeable. But if you looked closely, you could see that it tilted just a fraction of an inch to the left. The frame didn't mind. It had grown accustomed to its slight tilt, and it rather liked the way it caught the light in the late afternoon. The living room was quiet, save for the occasional ticking of a clock on the opposite wall. The frame spent its days observing the room, the beige walls, the beige carpet, the beige sofa. It watched as the sunlight moved across the room, casting soft shadows that shifted ever so slowly as the hours passed. It wasn't an exciting life, but it was a peaceful one. One day, after what felt like an eternity of hanging in the same spot, the door to the living room opened. The person walked in, carrying a feather duster. The frame watched as the person moved around the room, dusting the shelves, the coffee table, and the clock. The frame held its breath, metaphorically, of course, as the person approached. Would they notice the slight tilt? Would they straighten it? But no. The person dusted the frame without a second glance, leaving it just as crooked as it had been before. The frame felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. It wasn't sure why. It had grown used to its tilt, but part of it wondered what it would be like to hang perfectly straight. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. The frame continued to hang on the wall, slightly crooked, watching as the sunlight moved across the room. The door to the living room would open occasionally, and a person would walk in to dust or vacuum or water the single potted plant in the corner. But no one ever noticed the frame's slight tilt. It wasn't an exciting life. It was a peaceful one, and the frame was content. Years passed, and the frame remained on the wall, slightly crooked, watching as the sunlight moved across the room. The photograph inside the frame faded slightly, the colors becoming softer and more muted. But the frame didn't mind. It liked the way the photograph looked, as if it had been gently worn by time. One day, after what felt like an eternity of hanging in the same spot, the door to the living room opened again. This time, a different person walked in. They were carrying a small step stool and a level. Frame watched as the person set up the stool and climbed onto it. They reached out and gently touched the frame, adjusting it ever so slightly. The frame felt a strange sensation as it was straightened. He wasn't sure if it liked the change. It had grown so used to its slight tilt that being perfectly straight felt odd. But as the person stepped back to admire their work, the frame realized that it didn't mind. It was still the same frame, still holding the same photograph, still hanging on the same wall. The person left the room, closing the door behind them. The frame was alone again, but it didn't feel lonely. It had his photograph, its wall, and its sunlight, and that was enough. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. The frame continued to hang on the wall, now perfectly straight, watching as the sunlight moved across the room. The door to the living room would open occasionally, and a person would walk in to dust or vacuum or water the single potted plant in the corner. But no one ever noticed the frame's perfect straightness. It wasn't an exciting life, but it was a peaceful one. And the frame was content, and so the frame's journey continued, day after day, year after year. It was never moved, never replaced, and never noticed. But it didn't mind. It had its photograph, its wall, and its sunlight, and that was enough, because sometimes the most uneventful lives are the most peaceful ones, and the frame was at peace. In a small, unassuming house on a quiet street, there was a door. This door was not particularly special. It was made of plain wood, painted a soft shade of white, and it led to a room that was rarely used. The room itself was unremarkable, just a small space with a single window, a chair, and a table. But the door had one feature, set it apart, ever so slightly, its doorknob. The doorknob was old, made of brass that had long since lost its shine. It was slightly loose, turning with a soft, creaky sound whenever someone used it. But no one used it often. The door was rarely opened, and the doorknob spent most of its time just sitting there, waiting for something to happen. The doorknob didn't mind. It had grown used to its quiet existence. It enjoyed the way the sunlight filtered through the window in the room, casting a soft glow on the door. It liked the way the air in the house smelled faintly of dust and old wood. It wasn't an exciting life, but it was a peaceful one. One day, after what felt like an eternity of sitting in the same spot, the door creaked open. A person walked in, carrying a box. The doorknob watched as the person set the box down on the table and began to unpack it. Inside the box were old books, papers, and a few small trinkets. The person didn't stay long. They left the room, closing the door behind them, and the doorknob was alone again. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. The doorknob continued to sit there, loose and slightly creaky, watching as the sunlight moved across the room. The door would open occasionally, and a person would walk in to add more items to the table or to dust the chair. But most of the time, the doorknob was alone. It wasn't an exciting life, but it was a peaceful one, and the doorknob was content. Years passed, and the doorknob remained on the door, loose and slightly creaky, watching as the sunlight moved across the room. The items on the table grew dustier and more forgotten, but the doorknob didn't mind. It was just happy to have something to observe. One day, after what felt like an eternity of sitting in the same spot, the door creaked open again. This time, a different person walked in. They were carrying a toolbox. The doorknob watched as the person set the toolbox down and began to examine the door. They tested the doorknob, turning it back and forth, and then they reached into the toolbox and pulled out a screwdriver. The doorknob felt a strange sensation as the person tightened its screws. It wasn't sure if it liked the change. It had grown so used to being loose and creaky that being tightened felt odd. But as the person stepped back to admire their work, the doorknob realized that it didn't mind. It was still the same doorknob, still on the same door, still leading to the same room. The person left the room, closing the door behind them. The doorknob was alone again, but it didn't feel lonely. It had its door, its room, and its sunlight, and that was enough. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. The doorknob continued to sit there, now tight and silent, watching as the sunlight moved across the room. The door would open occasionally, and a person would walk in to add more items to the table or to dust the chair. But most of the time, the doorknob was alone. It wasn't an exciting life, but it was a peaceful one, and the doorknob was content. And so the doorknob's journey continued day after day, year after year. It was never replaced, never noticed, and never used often. But it didn't mind. It had its door, its room, and its sunlight, and that was enough. Because sometimes the most uneventful lives are the most peaceful ones, and the doorknob was at peace. In a vast open sky, there floated a cloud. This cloud was not particularly large or fluffy or shaped like anything interesting. It was just a cloud, a small, wispy thing that drifted lazily across the sky. It wasn't the kind of cloud that would catch your eye or make you stop and stare. It was just there, part of the scenery, like the blue of the sky or the occasional bird that flew by. The cloud had been floating in the sky for as long as it could remember. It had seen countless sunrises and sunsets, countless stars twinkling in the night. It had drifted over fields and forests, cities and towns, but it had never stayed in one place for long. It wasn't an exciting life, but it was a peaceful one. One day, after what felt like an eternity of floating in the same sky, the cloud felt a gentle breeze. It wasn't a strong wind, just a soft, steady current that pushed the cloud ever so slightly to the east. The cloud didn't mind. It liked the feeling of moving, of drifting slowly across the sky. As the cloud drifted, it passed over a small town. It wasn't a particularly interesting town, just a collection of houses, a few shops, and a park with a single tree. The cloud watched as the people below went about their day, walking their dogs, pushing strollers, and sitting on benches. No one looked up at the cloud. No one ever did. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. The cloud continued to drift across the sky, watching as the world below changed with the seasons. The leaves on the trees turned from green to gold to brown, and then they fell, leaving the branches bare. The snow covered the ground, and then it melted, and the grass began to grow again. It wasn't an exciting life, but it was a peaceful one, and the cloud was content. Years passed, and the cloud continued to drift across the sky, watching as the world below changed with the seasons. It wasn't the same cloud it had been at the beginning. Clouds are always changing after all, but it was still there, still drifting, still watching. One day, after what felt like an eternity of floating in the same sky, the cloud felt a change in the air. It wasn't a strong wind, just a soft, steady current that pushed the cloud ever so slightly to the west. The cloud didn't mind. It liked the feeling of moving, of drifting slowly across the sky. As the cloud drifted, it passed over the same small town it had seen before. The town hadn't changed much. The same houses, the same shops, the same park with the same tree. The cloud watched as the people below went about their day, walking their dogs, pushing strollers, and sitting on benches. No one looked up at the cloud. No one ever did. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. The cloud continued to drift across the sky, watching as the world below changed with the seasons. The leaves on the trees turned from green to gold to brown, and then they fell, leaving the branches bare. The snow covered the ground, and then it melted, and the grass began to grow again. It wasn't an exciting life. It was a peaceful one, and the cloud was content. And so the cloud's journey continued, day after day, year after year. It was never noticed, never admired, and never remembered. But it didn't mind. It had its sky, its breeze, and its view of the world below. And that was enough, because sometimes the most uneventful lives are the most peaceful ones, and the cloud was at peace. In a small, dimly lit room, there sat a candle. This candle was not particularly tall or elegant. It was just a simple, white candle, about the size of a teacup, with a wick that had never been lit. The candle had been sitting on the shelf for as long as it could remember, surrounded by other candles, all equally unlit and forgotten. The candle's life was uneventful, to say the least. It spent most of its time sitting on the shelf, waiting for something to happen, but nothing ever did. The room was quiet, save for the occasional sound of footsteps passing by in the hallway. The candle didn't mind. It enjoyed the soft, dim light that filtered through the curtains, casting gentle shadows on the walls. One day, after what felt like an eternity of sitting in the same spot, the door to the room opened. A person walked in, carrying a matchbox. The candle watched as the person struck a match and lit one of the other candles on the shelf. The flame flickered softly, casting a warm glow on the room. The person didn't stay long. They left the room, closing the door behind them, and the candle was alone again. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. The candle continued to sit there, unlit and forgotten, watching as the sunlight moved across the room. The door would open occasionally, and a person would walk in to light one of the other candles. It's just a shelf. But most of the time, the candle was alone. It wasn't an exciting life, but it was a peaceful one, and the candle content. Years passed, and the candle remained on the shelf, unlit and forgotten, watching as the sunlight moved across the room. The other candles on the shelf were lit occasionally, but the candle was always left behind. It wasn't sure why. Maybe it was too small, or too plain, or maybe it was just too unremarkable to be noticed. One day, after what felt like an eternity of sitting in the same spot, the door to the room opened again. This time, a different person walked in. They were carrying a matchbox, but instead of lighting one of the other candles, they reached for the quiet candle. The candle felt a strange mix of excitement and dread as the person struck a match and held it to its wick. The candle's wick caught fire, and the flame flickered softly, casting a warm glow on the room. The person didn't stay long. They left the room, closing the door behind them, and the candle was alone again. But this time, it wasn't just sitting there. It was burning slowly and steadily, its flame flickering softly in the dim light. The candle watched as the sunlight moved across the room, mingling with the soft glow of its flame. It wasn't an exciting life, but it was a peaceful one, and the candle was content. So the candle's journey continued, day after day, year after year. It was never lit often, never admired, and never remembered, but it didn't mind. It had its shelf, its flame, and its view of the room. And that was enough, because sometimes The most uneventful lives are the most peaceful ones, and the candle was at peace. On a vast, endless beach there lay a grain of sand. This grain of sand was not particularly special. It was not the shiniest grain, nor the smoothest, nor the largest. It was just a grain of sand, one among billions, indistinguishable from the others. The grain of sand had been on the beach for as long as it could remember, surrounded by other grains of sand, all equally unremarkable. The grain of sand's life was uneventful, to say the least. It spent most of its time lying there, waiting for something to happen. But nothing ever did. The beach was quiet, save for the occasional sound of waves crashing in the distance. The grain of sand didn't mind. It enjoyed the feeling of the sun on its surface, the gentle breeze that occasionally stirred the sand around it. One day, after what felt like an eternity of lying in the same spot, the grain of sand felt a change in the air. A soft breeze began to blow, stirring the sand around it. The grain of sand felt a strange sensation as it was lifted into the air, carried by the breeze. It wasn't sure where it was going, but it didn't really matter. It was just glad to be moving. The breeze carried the grain of sand across the beach, over the dunes, and into the air. The grain of sand felt a sense of freedom as it drifted, carried by the wind. It wasn't sure how long it had been in the air, but eventually the breeze began to die down, and the grain of sand felt itself falling back to the ground. It landed on a different part of the beach, surrounded by different grains of sand. The grain of sand didn't mind. It was still on the same beach, still surrounded by the same endless expanse of sand. It wasn't an exciting life, but it was a peaceful one, and the grain of sand was content. Years passed, and the grain of sand remained on the beach, surrounded by other grains of sand, all equally unremarkable. The breeze would occasionally stir the sand, lifting the grain of sand into the air and carrying it to a different part of the beach. But most of the time, the grain of sand was just lying there, waiting for something to happen. One day, after what felt like an eternity of lying in the same spot, the grain of sand felt a change in the air. A soft breeze began to blow, stirring the sand around it. The grain of sand felt a strange sensation as it was lifted into the air, carried by the breeze. It wasn't sure where it was going, but it didn't really matter. It was just glad to be moving. The breeze carried the grain of sand across the beach, over the dunes, and into the air. The grain of sand felt a sense of freedom as it drifted, carried by the wind. It wasn't sure how long it had been in the air, but eventually the breeze began to die down, and the grain of sand felt itself falling back to the ground. It landed on a different part of the beach, surrounded by different grains of sand. The grain of sand didn't mind. It was still on the same beach, still surrounded by the same endless expanse of sand. It wasn't an exciting life, but it was a peaceful one, and the grain of sand was content. And so the grain of sand's journey continued day after day, year after year. It was never noticed, never admired, and never remembered. But it didn't mind. It had its beach, its breeze, and its view of the endless expanse of sand. And that was enough, because sometimes the most uneventful lives are the most peaceful ones. And the grain of sand was at peace. Once upon a time, in a town that was neither particularly famous nor entirely unknown, there lived a man named Gregory. Gregory was an unbothered sort of fellow. He was not prone to excitement, nor was he given to unnecessary worrying. In fact, most who knew him would describe him as remarkably calm or consistently unhurried. He lived in a small house that was just the right size, not too big, not too small, painted a shade of beige that was neither too light nor too dark. On this particular evening, Gregory found himself sitting in his favorite chair, which was positioned at precisely the right distance from the fireplace, close enough to feel the warmth, but not so close as to feel overheated. The fire crackled in a way that was neither too loud nor too quiet, and he found it quite pleasant. He reached for his book, a novel he had been reading for some time. It was not particularly thrilling, but it was adequate, and Gregory appreciated that. He turned a page, then another. The sentences flowed at a reasonable pace. Nothing surprising had happened in the book so far, and that was perfectly fine with him. After a while he set the book down and looked at the clock. It was not quite time for bed, but it was also no longer early. It was, in many ways, the sort of time that was best described as the evening. He considered his options. He could continue reading, or perhaps make himself a cup of tea. Neither choice was particularly urgent, and so he sat for a moment, enjoying the sense of time passing in a steady, predictable way. Eventually he decided on the tea. He stood up, stretched in a manner that was neither excessive nor insufficient, and walked to the kitchen. The floorboards creaked ever so slightly underfoot, though not in a disruptive way. He filled the kettle with water, set it on the stove, and turned the knob to a setting that was appropriately moderate. As he waited for the water to boil, he looked out the window. The street outside was quiet. A cat sat on a low wall, staring into the distance, as if contemplating something profound. Gregory watched the cat for a moment. The cat did not move. Gregory nodded slightly, then turned back to his task. The kettle began to whistle, though not aggressively. He removed it from the heat, poured the water into his mug, and added a tea bag. Tea steeped at a steady pace. He watched the color change gradually, as it always did. Then, after an appropriate amount of time, he removed the tea bag and added a small amount of honey. Not too much, not too little. Gregory took his tea back to his chair. He sipped it. It was warm, but not uncomfortably so. The taste was familiar. He sat quietly, thinking about nothing in particular, as the fire continued to crackle in its unremarkable yet pleasant way. Outside, the cat stretched. Then it resumed sitting. Gregory finished his tea. He set the cup down and looked at the clock once more. Now it was properly evening. He stood up, walked to the window, and pulled the curtain closed with a slow, steady motion. He turned, walked to the bedroom, and changed into his nightclothes. He lay down in bed. The sheets were cool, but not cold, and the pillow had the right amount of fluffiness. He turned onto his side, then onto his back, then onto his side again, before settling in a position that was precisely comfortable enough. Then he closed his eyes, and, as expected, he fell asleep. It had been a good evening. Not too exciting, not too dull, just right. Once upon a time, in a village that was neither particularly bustling nor particularly quiet, there lived a man named Walter. Walter was a man of simple routines and predictable habits. He enjoyed waking up at the same time each day, eating meals at the same time, and completing small, uncomplicated tasks at a pace best described as leisurely. One morning, Walter awoke at precisely the same time as he always did. He stretched, not extravagantly, but with a slow, measured motion, before rising from his bed. The floor beneath his feet was pleasantly cool, but not cold. He shuffled to the window and looked outside. The sky was a soft shade of greyish blue, with clouds drifting at a rate that could be considered moderate. Walter nodded to himself. It would be a perfectly acceptable day. After dressing in his usual manner, Walter made his way to the kitchen. He prepared a breakfast that was neither overly indulgent nor particularly austere. Porridge with a touch of honey, a slice of lightly toasted bread, and a cup of tea. He ate it at a steady pace, appreciating the gentle flavors, though feeling strongly about them. Once he had finished, he looked at the small list of tasks he had written the night before. "Buy more flour," it read. Walter considered this for a moment, before deciding that, yes, today would indeed be a fine day for purchasing flour. He put on his coat, which was neither too thick nor too thin, and stepped outside. The air was crisp but not biting. He walked at a pace that was neither hurried nor sluggish, following the path he always took to the village shop. Along the way he passed the usual sights: the baker's shop with its faint scent of freshly made bread, the cobbler's shop with its display of sturdy, well-made shoes, and the quiet bench under the large tree where Mr. Benson often sat. Sure enough, Mr. Benson was there, sitting exactly as expected. Walter gave him a nod. "Morning," Walter said. "Morning," Mr. Benson replied. There was no need for further conversation. Walter continued walking. After a few more steps, he arrived at the shop. The bell above the door gave a gentle chime as he stepped inside. The shopkeeper, Mrs. Cartwright's, was arranging sacks of flour on a shelf. "Morning, Walter," she said. "Morning, Mrs. Cartwright," Walter replied. He made his way to the flour section. There were several options, all similar, but Walter took a moment to examine them nonetheless. He picked up a sack, tested its weight in his hands, and then placed it in his basket. It was an entirely satisfactory sack of flour. He walked to the counter where Mrs. Cartwright was now arranging apples. "Just the flour today?" she asked. "Yes," Walter said. She nodded and began the transaction. Walter placed the appropriate number of coins on the counter. She counted them, though there was no real need, as Walter always paid the exact amount, and nodded in approval. "Thank you, Walter. Have a good day." "You as well," Walter said. He picked up his sack of flour and walked out of the shop. The door shut with a soft click behind him. The walk home was much like the walk there. The tree was still standing, the bench still occupied by Mr. Benson, and the sky still holding its same greyish blue hue. Upon reaching his house, Walter set the flour in its designated spot. He stood for a moment, surveying his kitchen, feeling the quiet satisfaction of having completed his errand. He poured himself another cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the clouds drift. It was, as he had expected, a perfectly acceptable day. Not too exciting, not too dull. Just right. Once upon a time, in a village that was neither particularly lively nor especially quiet, there lived a woman named Margaret. Margaret was a woman of steadfast habits. She liked her tea a certain way, kept her home tidy but not excessively so, and found great comfort in the predictability of her days. On this particular afternoon, Margaret sat in her usual chair by the window, sipping a cup of chamomile tea. The tea was warm but not too hot, steeped for exactly the right amount of time. Outside, the clouds moved at a slow, steady pace across the sky. Occasionally, a bird would land on the fence, stay for a moment, and then fly away. Margaret observed this with mild interest, but no particular excitement. At precisely the time she expected, the postman arrived. She watched as he walked at a moderate pace up to her door, placed the mail in the slot, and then continued on his way. Margaret let out a soft sigh. She supposed it was time to check the mail. She set her teacup down gently on the saucer, making sure it didn't clatter, and rose from her chair. The wooden floor creaked softly beneath her feet, not in an intrusive way, just enough to acknowledge her movement. She reached the front door and bent down to retrieve the letters. There were 3 pieces of mail, one from the bank, one from a catalogue she sometimes browsed but rarely ordered from, and one from her cousin Mildred. Margaret shuffled the letters in her hands, assessing the order in which she would open them. She decided to start with a letter from the bank, as it was likely to contain nothing of immediate importance, but should be acknowledged nonetheless. She walked back to a chair, settled in, and retrieved her letter opener from the side table. The envelope opened cleanly, revealing a statement that was, as she expected, unremarkable. Her account balance was much the same as last month. She nodded in quiet approval, then set the letter aside. Next was the catalogue. Margaret flipped through it slowly, looking at the practical household items and modest clothing options. She paused on a page advertising a set of tea towels, wondering if she might need new ones. After a moment of contemplation, she decided that her current towels were still in good condition and set the catalogue aside. Finally, she opened the letter from her cousin Mildred. It was written in Mildred's usual careful handwriting, with a detailed update about the weather, a brief mention of a neighbour's cat, and an account of a small gathering she had attended. Margaret read each sentence slowly, absorbing the information at a leisurely pace. She would, of course, write a reply in a few days' time, mentioning her own quiet happenings. Margaret placed the letter in a small box where she kept correspondence. She took a sip of her now slightly cooler tea and glanced at the clock. There were still several hours left in the afternoon. Perhaps she would read for a bit, or perhaps she would sit quietly and listen to the faint rustling of the trees outside. She decided she would think about it for a while before making a final choice. And so the afternoon passed. Not too exciting, not too dull, just right. Once upon a time, in a small but adequately sized village, there lived a man named Harold. Harold was neither particularly young nor particularly old. He had lived in the same house for many years, a house painted in a colour that could only be described as neutral. Harold liked his routines. He found comfort in knowing what would happen each day, and he did not much care for surprises, not because they were upsetting, but because they tended to require extra effort to deal with. On this particular morning, Harold awoke at his usual time, just as the sun was beginning to rise. He lay in bed for a few moments, blinking up at the ceiling, listening to the faint sound of birds chirping outside. The chirping was not overly loud or particularly melodious, but it was, as always, present. After a suitable amount of time spent lying in bed, Harold sat up and stretched. The stretch was neither too short nor too long, just enough to loosen his joints. He got out of bed, put on his slippers, and walked to the kitchen at a slow, even pace. The floorboards creaked slightly beneath his weight, but not in an alarming way. Breakfast was the same as it was every morning. A bowl of plain oatmeal, a slice of toast with a modest amount of butter, and a cup of tea that was brewed for precisely the right length of time. Harold sat at his small wooden table, eating his breakfast with no particular hurry, gazing out the window at the street beyond. It was quiet. The sky was an unremarkable shade of greyish-blue. A single dog trotted past, sniffing to the bush before continuing on its way. After breakfast, Harold washed his dishes, dried them, and placed them back in their designated spots. He wiped the counter, though it's not particularly dirty, and then stood for a moment, considering what task he should complete that day. His eyes landed on the fence outside. It was, in most respects, a fine fence, sturdy, unassuming, but as Harold inspected it from his window, he noticed that a particular section of it appeared to be slightly askew. It was not broken. It was not falling over, but it was, by a very small degree, leaning. Harold exhaled softly through his nose. It seemed that today's task had been decided. He took his time gathering the necessary tools, a hammer, a small bag of nails, and a level. He carried them outside at a reasonable pace, stepping onto the slightly damp grass. The air smelled faintly of earth, though not in an overwhelming way. He stood before the fence, examining the slight tilt. It was indeed minor, but now that he had seen it, he could not simply leave it. First, Harold placed the level against the fence. He watched the bubble in the vial slowly shift before settling just slightly off-center. He nodded to himself, confirming what he already knew. He then pressed a hand against the leaning section, giving it a gentle nudge. The fence responded with the faintest creak but did not move much. This was good. It meant the repair would be straightforward. Harold knelt down, inspecting the base. The soil had shifted ever so slightly over time, allowing the post to lean just enough to be noticeable. He considered his options. He could dig around the base and adjust the post, but that seemed excessive. Instead, he decided to reinforce it with a few well-placed nails. He reached for his hammer, positioned a nail, and tapped it into the wood with a series of soft rhythmic strikes. The sound was neither too loud nor too quiet, just steady. Once the first nail was in place, he added another, then another. Fence held firm. Harold tested it with a light push. It remained upright. Satisfied, he picked up his level once more and placed it against the post. The bubble shifted. Then slowly it settled directly in the center. Harold exhaled, this time with a slight sense of accomplishment. The fence was straight once again. He gathered his tools, brushed off his hands, and took a step back to survey his work. It looked exactly the same as before, except now it was correct. This pleased Harold in a quiet, unspoken way. Feeling that he had earned a break, he walked back inside and put on a fresh pot of tea. As he waited for the water to boil, he looked out the window again. The dog had returned, sniffing at the same bush as before. The kettle whistled, a sound that was neither abrupt nor prolonged. Harold removed it from the stove, poured the hot water over the tea leaves, and let them steep. He sat at his table once more, the warmth of the teacup pleasant against his fingers. The afternoon stretched before him, open and unhurried. Perhaps he would take a short walk, or perhaps he would sit in his chair and listen to the distant sound of the wind moving through the trees. There was no rush. There was never a rush. Not too exciting, not too dull, just right. Once upon a time, in a village that was neither too large nor too small, there lived a woman named Eleanor. Eleanor was a woman of patience, of quiet habits, and of a disposition that could best be described as unflustered. She found joy in small, predictable things, such as the way her curtains billowed ever so slightly when the window was open, or how the wooden floor creaked in the exact same spot every morning when she walked across it. She was never in a hurry, never particularly restless, and never one to deviate much from routine. One fine morning, which was neither too bright nor too dreary, Eleanor woke up at her usual time. She lay in bed for a moment, listening to the sounds of the house, the faint ticking of the clock in the next room, the soft rustling of leaves outside her window, the occasional distant chirp of a bird that was neither particularly melodic nor jarring. After a few moments of calm observation, she stretched, not in a rushed or exaggerated manner, but just enough to ease the stiffness from sleep. Eleanor got out of bed and made her way to the kitchen. She prepared her morning tea, her preferred blend of chamomile and mint, steeped for exactly the right amount of time. While waiting for it to brew, she arranged a small breakfast, a slice of bread, lightly toasted with a thin spread of butter, and a bowl of porridge stirred just enough to ensure a smooth consistency. She sat by the window and ate her breakfast at a leisurely pace, savouring each bite in an unremarkable yet entirely satisfying way. As she sipped her tea, she looked outside and noted that it was a good day for a walk, not because the weather was particularly fine, but because she had decided, the evening before, that she would take a walk today. After finishing her tea, she took her time washing the dishes. The warm water was pleasant on her hands, and she methodically wiped each dish dry before placing it back in its designated spot. Once everything was in order, she retrieved her shawl, one that was neither too heavy nor too light, and draped it over her shoulders. Then, without any great sense of urgency, she stepped outside. The air was neither too warm nor too cold. It was simply there, gently present, filling her lungs with a sense of calm familiarity. She started walking at a comfortable pace, her steps falling into a natural rhythm against the cobbled path. The village was quiet, but not silent. Occasionally she would hear the faint murmur of conversation from an open window or the sound of a cart rolling over the stones in the distance. As she walked, she passed by the baker's shop. The scent of fresh bread lingered in the air, mild, pleasant. She glanced at the loaves in the window, each one perfectly shaped and golden brown. She considered for a brief moment whether she needed to buy more bread. Then she remembered that she still had a loaf at home, and she continued walking. A little further down, she saw Mr. Thompson tending to his garden. He was carefully trimming the edges of his hedges, his movements precise and measured. As she passed by, he looked up and gave her a small nod. "Morning, Eleanor," he said. "Morning, Mr. Thompson," she replied. There was no need for further conversation. She continued on her way, her pace unchanging. After a while she reached the small wooden bench beneath the old oak tree. It was a good bench, sturdy, comfortable in a simple way. She decided to sit for a while. The tree's leaves rustled faintly in the breeze, a soft and steady sound, particularly notable. She looked up at the sky. The clouds moved slowly, neither too fast nor too still. It was the kind of sky that made no grand declarations about the weather, simply existing as it always did. A small bird landed near her feet. It pecked at the ground once or twice, then looked up at her, as if considering whether she might have any crumbs to offer. When it became clear that she did not, it hopped away at an unhurried pace before flying off. After some time, not too long, but not too short, Eleanor stood up and resumed her walk. She followed the path that she always took, winding through the village at a pace that remained steady and calm. When she reached the small stone bridge that arched over the stream, she paused for a moment to watch the water move below. It flowed neither too quickly nor too slowly, rippling in a manner that was neither dramatic nor dull. She stood there for a time, simply watching. The water continued to flow, as it always did. The wind moved through the trees, as it always had. Nothing particularly noteworthy happened, and that was just as it should be. Eleanor turned and made her way back home. The village remained just as it had been when she left. Quiet, steady, perfectly ordinary. When she reached her house, she stepped inside, closed the door gently behind her, and removed her shawl, folding it neatly before setting it aside. She went to the kitchen and made herself another cup of tea. The scent of chamomile and mint filled the air once more as she settled into her chair. Outside, the sky remained its same soft shade of greyish-blue, the clouds drifting as they always did. She let out a small, contented sigh. Not too exciting, not too dull, just right.